Welcome back everyone. Let's go ahead and talk about the iPad 5 and see how it holds up in 2021. Now this iPad came out a couple of years ago. It definitely isn't the latest and greatest iPad anymore, but there are still a ton of people who use this type of iPad. And I think there are some areas that I think it is great in still, but ultimately I will tell you this iPad is going to be dated fairly sooner than later. Even though it just came out in 2017, it's approaching that 4-year-old mark and actually next month. But on top of that, it does have an outdated chipset inside of it, and it would probably be better off if you go and upgrade to something like an iPad, Pro 2nd Gen at the very minimum, but something like an iPad Air 3 may be better, and I will leave those linked down below. You can get them from there, but you can also go to cheapphones.co, which is my website, and I think I have iPads on there too, which you can go and pick up if you want to. So you can help support the channel those ways if you want. But starting off with the front of the iPad 5th generation, we can see that we have that 9.7-inch IPS panel on the front, and this is pretty much the same exact type of iPad display that we've had on a ton of other iPads. And I think this is one of the strongest areas that this iPad really kills it in. I think the panel is a really solid, thing still. I think the home button on the front doesn't really age it too much. There is a little bit of bezel around it, but it's really not that bad. And when you look at something like the iPad 8th generation, it's not really too far off. So I think this iPad, in terms of a design standpoint on the front, really isn't even that dated. And I think it really is actually probably better than not even being a Pro. Now you do have the lightning port on the bottom as well as a headphone jack, so you still have that capability of, plugging in I/O and doing anything you want to in that standpoint too. So I think in terms of the I/O that you have on this thing is still great. You have more than an iPhone, so I think that's pretty cool. And on the back, you have that aluminum back still, which, like I said before, whether you pick up the cheapest iPhone or you pick up the most expensive iPad, and I said, I meant to say iPad there, you're going to have a really good experience on it in terms of a build quality standpoint. You can still pick up the first iPad, and that thing is still a killer in terms of a build quality. That thing still feels very good in the hand, and as I said before, it's one of its biggest assets for sure. So in terms of the outside, you have that single camera setup on the back, single camera setup on the front as well, and for sure it's a very good feeling iPad at the end of the day. So in terms of the body standpoint, thumbs up for me. I think it still kills it. Now, moving on to the camera, we might as well hit on it right now. Like I said, a single camera setup on the back, and it's an 8 megapixel sensor. Now, this camera is pretty much the same thing that we have on something like an iPhone 6. So it's an 8 megapixel sensor. You can do full HD videos on it at 30 frames per second. And I think that's a pretty cool thing. I'm really glad it has that type of capability. But take it as you will. I really don't think it's like the craziest, best looking camera in the world. And I think it would have been better had it had something like a 12 megapixel sensor. But I think if you're just taking quick little photos and videos, I think it's going to be okay. But again, keep in the back of your head that it is a iPhone 6 camera on the back of this thing, and on the front you have a 1.2 megapixel sensor. You can do 720p videos on that, and I think also that's a pretty cool thing. I think that's awesome you have that type of capability. But here's the biggest thing to keep in mind. I don't really think anybody's going to be using your iPad camera all that often. I think more people are probably going to be using these things to do video calls, to do Zoom calls or FaceTime calls or whatever the case is, and this iPad I think is a really solid contender. I think if you're going to do those type of things, then I think go for it. I think it's going to be great. But if you're trying to go and use this iPad to film a bunch of videos or do something like TikTok videos or something like that, you may have a different experience that everyone else may not be okay with. So keep that in mind. That's kind of what I'm thinking. But in terms of, a build quality standpoint, in terms of a camera standpoint, that pretty much covers up the iPad 5th generation in 2021. Now moving on to, I think, probably the best thing about this phone. I think this is probably the best thing about this device right now. And it's the software, but it's kind of like the worst thing about this phone, right? Or this iPad right now too. And it's kind of sad because right now this device, as far as we know, is probably not going to be getting iOS 15. Even though it came out a year or two after the iPhone 6s came out, it shares the same chipset, and it's looking like the iPhone 6s is not going to be getting iOS 15. So that might mean that the iPad 5th generation may not be getting iOS 15 either. And that's kind of a sad thing, but it's also kind of expected. I've been kind of saying that for a minute now, and because this thing, like I said, has that A9 chip inside of it, it's the same thing. It's not even A9X or anything. It's literally the same thing as the iPhone 6s, and I really don't think this thing's going to be getting the next generation of software. So what does that mean? That means if you pick up this iPad right now, you're going to be fine. It's probably going to get security updates here and there. But the other thing to keep in mind is that iOS 15 isn't really looking to be a crazy big upgrade in some areas. I think things, like split screen multitasking and all those things are already on the iPad 5th generation. So you're really not going to be missing out on too much in that standpoint. So I think when it comes down to that, this iPad, even though it's getting outdated in software, I think you can probably give it another like 1 or 2 year run, and I think you'll still be fine, probably even more than that if you really need to. So I think you'll be fine in that standpoint. But like I said, going up to something like the iPad Air 3, you're going to be getting a much longer lifespan on that device than on this one. So keep that in mind. I think the best thing, or one of the better things about this iPad, is the battery life, and this thing has an 8,827 mAh battery inside of it, and that is a massive size battery to have on this type of device. I mean, you're going to be lasting for an insanely long amount of time, and like I said before, if you're kind of a minor task person, if you're just doing a bunch of like small things, or if you're taking it up a notch and doing a bunch of different things too, I think you're going to be getting a solid type of device from this thing. In terms of a battery life, you're going to be lasting for an insanely long amount of time in terms of battery life. So I think the battery life is the best thing about this device right now, but at the same time, I think the software is one of those things that's going to age this iPad sooner than later. So in terms of that pretty much covers up that specific aspect of it. Now, ending it off with the performance, as I said before, these iPads do a solid job in terms of their performance standpoint, because you tend to kind of compare it more so to something like a laptop than you do to an iPhone or something. And this device is a really good alternative to both. It kind of sits in the middle of it. But I will tell you, the performance is kind of becoming a little bit, choppy. It's being a little bit glitchy. So it has that Apple A9 chip, like I said before. It has 2 gigs of RAM as well, which isn't that bad. I mean, 2 gigs of RAM is actually pretty respectable. But as I stated before, it's kind of coming into a point where it's a little bit more choppy than usual. And I think ever since iPadOS 14, it's been a little bit more glitchier than we're hoping it to be. But I think take it as you will. But at this point, getting something like the iPad 5th generation is probably going to give you a much glitchier experience than you were hoping to get. I think if you're somebody who wants to go ahead and use an iPad for something just kind of like getting out of the way and just kind of having a good experience with, I think you're going to be okay for the most part, as I stated before. But if you're somebody who wants to take it up a notch and do bigger and better things, you may be getting a stranger experience on this type of iPad. So keep that in mind. Again, I don't want to sit here and say it's like the worst experience ever, but it is going to be giving you a glitchier experience than you may be expecting. Now, keeping that in your head and keeping that in mind, another big thing about this iPad that you should know is that pretty much if you're a basic task person, meaning if you just want to use it for like an entertainment device or something along those lines, I think you're going to be getting a solid experience from this thing. I think if you just wanted to just play some music or play whatever, I think you're going to be okay. I really don't think it's going to be that bad of an iPad. But as I stated before, if you're wanting to go and pick up something else and have a much better experience from it, you may be better off picking something up, like the iPad 7th gen, the 8th gen, the iPad Air 3. Those iPads are going to be giving you a much better experience, in my opinion. But I think if you, like I said before, if you just want to use an iPad to kind of get out of the way, to basically use it more so as a, entertainment device, if you're a basic task type of person, like I said before, I think you're going to be okay. But if you try to take it up a notch, it may mean that you're probably going to be getting a stranger experience from it at the end of the day. So in terms of me, and in terms of the performance, that's kind of how I see it right now. And to kind of sum up this video and to answer the question, should you go and pick up an iPad 5th generation in 2021? Well, this is what I'll tell you, and I've said this before. I think if you're currently using this iPad, you're probably going to be getting an okay experience. I think you're going to be okay if you use it for, until its end of life. But I think if you don't have an iPad yet, or if you currently are contemplating on whether you want one or you don't want one or whatever, you may be better off if you go ahead and pick up something else like an iPad 7th generation, an iPad Air 3, something like that. Those type of iPads are going to be giving you a much better experience than this type of iPad. And I think, like I said before, if you're somebody who wants to go and continuously use an iPad for everything that they can, then you may be better off getting something like the iPads that I just mentioned or that I have linked down below. But I think for the most part, this iPad still kills it in terms of the build quality standpoint. I think that's definitely one of the better areas of this iPad. When you pick this thing up, it doesn't feel like a cheap iPad, and I think that is probably one of the strongest things about it. On top of that, I feel like the cameras are a really good addition to it. I feel like the software that I got was really important, and I feel like it's still kind of, I think the screen is still very good as well. But I think the areas like the software, it's really not that great, and it's definitely going to feel like you have a dated iPad. On top of that, the battery life is amazing though, so there's a lot of flip-flopping. But as stated before, I think I would recommend picking up something like the iPad Air 3 or picking up like the iPad Pro 2nd gen at a bare minimum. I think the iPad Air 3 is probably the better way to go though. So in terms of that, that pretty much covers it up. If you guys have any other questions or anything like that, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber that we get really does count, so it means so much if you guys can hit that. Also check out the other links down in the description as well. My Twitter, my Instagram, my other channels. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.